This was all the way back in 1966, a night I still remember as clearly as yesterday. I was with a good friend of mine, Rich, during our high school years, and we were driving around Dayton, Ohio a little after 11 p.m. We had decided to take a cruise along Foothills Avenue in Rich's dad's Pontiac Le Mans because he had the car for the night. It was a convertible, so of course, we had the top down and the radio on, and it was a perfect summer night. We were coming up to Oakwood High School, and right across from the school, there was a football field called Mac Hummons Stadium. There was a wooded section along that area that was about 50 to 100 feet of dense trees separating the field from the road. The trees pretty much blocked our view of the field, but you could still see some light coming through. It was just a regular spot that we would drive by all the time. As we got closer, I noticed something strange out over the field. I glanced over and saw lights. At first, just little glimmers through the trees. It was on our left side over the football field, just a little above the tree line. These lights weren't normal stadium lights. They were different, softer, and much more diffused. They almost had a glow to them. I pointed them out to Rich, and at first we thought that they might be cleaning up after a game or practice. Getting even closer, we started talking about the possibility of it being the Goodyear blimp, which we saw often in Ohio. Blimps were common back then, so it definitely wasn't out of the question. Driving past it now, the lights started to look very different from any blimp we'd ever seen. They were pulsating and rotating with colors that shifted. I saw white, red, yellow, and green. It was beautiful in a strange way and almost mesmerizing. It was hard to tell if it was the lights themselves that were rotating or if the whole thing was spinning. We both went quiet, just staring at it. At this point, I started to make out a shape and could tell there was something large and solid behind the lights. It looked round or maybe a bit oval-shaped, but hard to see exactly what it was. The lights made it tricky to see the edges clearly. Then we noticed how low it was. This thing was only about 50 to 75 feet in the air, not even 20 feet above the treetops. It was flying lower than a blimp or plane ever would, and we also noticed that we weren't hearing anything at all. The silence is what hit me. With how low it was flying, I thought we should have heard something, but it was absolutely still. That's when we both started to get an uneasy feeling. We crossed over the railroad tracks, which separated the road from the school and the field, and that's when it seemed to get even closer. It was moving toward us, slowly gliding over the trees on our left. I remember leaning forward, trying to make out more details, and I could feel my heart rate picking up. The lights kept rotating, and now we could see the whole shape as clear as day. I told Rich to pull over. He slowed the car down and stopped on the side of the road, right by the woods and railroad tracks. As soon as he stopped the car, we turned the radio off, which was really weird because we could now confirm it was dead quiet. It wasn't just that the craft was silent, everything around us was silent too. No crickets or wind at all, just dead silence. I'd never heard anything like it, to be honest, and it almost made me feel like time had stopped. I remember climbing up on the back of the front seat, grabbing the top of the windshield with my hands for balance. I wanted to get a better look. This craft, whatever it was, had gotten even lower and closer to us now, probably only 20 feet off the ground and right at the tree line in front of us. It kept descending and almost looked like it was going to land, but it never did touch the ground. We could now fully see the size, and this thing was big. I'd estimate the diameter to be 150 feet. It was round, and along its sides we could see what looked like windows or holes. These windows wrapped around the entire side of it, and there was enough light coming from inside of these windows that we could almost see inside of it. Through the windows, we could clearly see two figures. They were silhouettes because of the bright light, but they were unmistakable. I remember one of them was standing straight, looking toward us, while the other seemed turned slightly, giving us a profile. They looked small and thin to us, and we could see the complete torso and head of both figures. The shape of these things were almost childlike, but at the same time there was nothing that looked childlike about them, if that makes sense. At this point, Rich and I were both just sitting there, staring in awe. He didn't move or say a word to me, and I felt glued in place myself. I remember thinking I could not believe how close we were to whatever this was. It felt absolutely surreal. We looked up as it flew directly over our car. We followed it with our heads as it passed and heard a faint humming sound. It was deep, like a vibration. It sounded like it was reverberating through the air rather than coming from the thing itself. And then, in literally a blink of an eye, it was gone. One moment it was hovering above us, the lights shining and the figures in the window, and the next moment, gone. I want to make this clear too. It didn't fly away and we didn't lose sight of it over the trees. It was just there 1 second and then it wasn't. I looked over at Rich and could tell he was in as much shock and disbelief as I was. I asked him out loud, "Where did it go?" We were both looking around in every direction, but it was truly like none of it even happened. Everything was completely back to normal. I jumped out of the car without even opening the door and ran toward the railroad tracks. The tracks were slightly elevated with a bit of an embankment on either side. I climbed up hoping to get a higher vantage point, thinking maybe I'd see something somewhere in the distance, but there was nothing. I walked at least 100 yards on those tracks looking in every possible direction, but whatever it was gone. I was getting frustrated and almost angry that it was gone, and more than anything, I was deeply confused. Eventually, I made my way back to the car. Rich was just sitting there in the driver's seat quietly, staring off into the trees and dazed. We didn't even say much to each other at first. I remember feeling like we'd just witnessed something that no one could possibly explain, and there was a sense of awe, but also a kind of dread. After a minute or two, I got back in the car, and Rich started driving us back toward our neighborhood. We said a few things to each other during the drive home, but looking back, we were pretty quiet. By the time we pulled up to my house, it was close to 1 a.m. I didn't really pay attention to time back then as a teenager, but when I thought about it later that night, I realized how much time had actually passed during the whole experience. That block of time from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. only felt like 15 minutes to me, and I couldn't understand why. I ended up going to bed but had a difficult time falling asleep. Over the next few nights, I had some of the most bizarre dreams I've ever had in my life. They were ultra vivid and unlike any dreams I'd ever had before or since. They felt more like memories than dreams. I don't remember them as clearly now, just fragments, but I've always felt that those dreams were somehow connected to what we saw that night, or at the very least some kind of PTSD from the whole experience. Since then, I've never once doubted what I saw. I know it was real, even if I can't explain it. I ended up moving out to the West Coast in my mid-20s, where I'm still at today, but in the mid-90s, I took a trip back east to visit family and drove out to that same spot on Far Hills Avenue with my son. We stopped and walked around for a while, and I even brought an old Sony Handycam to document it, but the whole area looks so different from when I was a teenager. There was a huge new church and several housing developments around it, and even a handful of new, smaller neighborhood roads cutting across the main road, so it just didn't look like it used to. I will never forget that night until the day I die, and it changed my life forever. Now that 50-something years have passed since it happened, I'm not expecting any kind of explanation. I guess it'll forever be one of those things in life that simply has no explanation. I had never planned on living at a homeless shelter in Holbrook, Arizona, but life has a way of taking turns you don't see coming. Long story short, that's where I was, just trying to get by, staying sober, and dealing with life one day at a time. I don't know if it's still there, but the shelter was right off I-40. It was a rough time in my life, but I had a roof over my head, good meals, and nice people around me. One evening, we were all in the main room eating dinner, some kind of stew with bread on the side if I remember correctly. I was zoning out, barely paying attention to the people around me, when two of the guys burst in the door, making a bunch of noise and telling everyone to come outside. They'd been out smoking, and one of them was waving his arms trying to get everyone's attention. I remember him saying, "You've got to come out here, you've got to see this." I wasn't totally shocked by it because weird stuff like that happens at shelters on a regular basis. You've got all sorts of people coming and going, and not all of them are in a good place mentally. But he was loud enough and serious enough that pretty soon people started standing up, leaving their plates and heading out the door to see what was going on, so I followed. When I got outside, the two guys were standing in the gravel, both pointing up at the sky over the highway. One of them was a guy named Frank that I had known for about a month. To get a quick picture of Frank, he was in his late 50s, about 6 feet tall, and couldn't weigh more than 110 pounds. He had a scraggly beard, no teeth, and he was a very twitchy, high-strung guy with a long history of addiction. He was pointing intensely, all wound up, and saying, "It was right there, right over the road." Holbrook isn't a big place, and I-40 runs right through it. At night, there's not a ton of traffic, just the rumble of semi-trucks going by. So when I looked where Frank was pointing, I didn't expect to see anything other than a plane, but there it was. A bright light, flickering almost like sparks were coming off of it, moving slowly across the sky. It was directly over the highway, too. At first, I thought it was a meteor or something burning up, but it didn't look right. It was moving slowly, and it looked like it was leaving these tiny little glimmers behind it, almost like embers from a campfire. We all kept watching, and just as I was starting to think it was a meteor, the thing stopped. Right over the highway, maybe a few hundred feet off the ground. It was close enough that I could easily see it had a metallic finish on the bottom of it. Not shiny like chrome, but more like dull metal. I squinted trying to see more details, and I could see sort of a raised section on top of it, almost like a cockpit or something. I would have thought it was a small plane going down for sure if it hadn't stopped in midair like that. Even a helicopter, but none of us could hear anything other than the highway, and I would also expect a helicopter to be falling if it were crashing, not just sitting there in the sky. I remember looking around at the other people and saw some of them pointing and others with their heads up and mouths open. One of the ladies that worked there was asking if she should call 911 in case it was a plane. A few people were shouting out guesses about what it was, but I think we all knew something wasn't right about the way it was hovering there. Then, after a minute or two, the thing started to move again. It didn't take off fast, it just started moving normally again. We all watched it as it flew farther over the highway and out away from town. This went on for several minutes as it got smaller and smaller. It felt like we could still see it miles away. Then finally, it was out of view. When it was over, there was a lot of talking about it from everyone as most of us walked back inside. I walked in with Frank, and he kept saying over and over, "I thought it was a meteor. I almost thought it was a meteor till it stopped like that." Once we got back inside, nobody really seemed interested in finishing dinner. Instead, we sat around talking about it and throwing around ideas. People brought up everything you can think of, from military planes and drones, to UFOs, to some secret government technology or testing out in the desert. The shelter staff was talking too. One of the ladies who worked there said she'd been there for 12 years and never seen anything like it. A lot of people were going in and out until really late hoping to see something else. I didn't sleep much that night. Whenever I closed my eyes, I'd picture the shape of that thing in my head and try to guess what it could have been. At one point, I actually got up and sketched what I could remember on paper while it was still fresh in my memory. It looks like a little kid's drawing, but I felt like I had to have some kind of picture to look at. The next morning, people were still buzzing about it at breakfast. Frank kept telling everyone who'd listen, trying to get the story straight, and after a while, we all started calling it the Holbrook UFO. That name stuck, and it was something I'll always remember. I was only in Holbrook for about a month after that and ended up going back to New Jersey where I have family. I'm doing a lot better these days. I have a good job, an apartment, a dog, and I am now over 9 years sober. I never go out of my way to talk about what happened, but I know what I saw, and I'll talk about it if the subject comes up. I haven't been back to Arizona since that time, but I'd love to take a trip out there again if I'm ever able to. Someday I'd like to stand in that same gravel parking lot and look up at night just to picture it all in my head again. My dad has told this story as far back as I can remember, and every time he tells it, it's exactly the same. It was the early 1980s, and he was still a teenager, out on a hunting trip with my grandpa in a really remote part of southwestern Idaho. There's nothing out there but grass and sagebrush as far as you can see. They set up camp at the bottom of these foothills, planning to hike up early in the morning before dawn and spend the day covering some ground. My grandpa woke him up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was still completely dark out and freezing cold. They got dressed, got their hunting gear together, and started heading up the hill behind where they were camped. The only light was from the moon, which was bright enough that my dad could still see their camp below them as they hiked up the hill, even in the dark. About halfway up, my dad stopped to catch his breath, and when he turned around to look back at the valley, he saw a group of small red lights scattered around their campsite below. He didn't know what to make of it at first because there was no way the lights were from people. There was no one else around when they started hiking up the hill, and the lights definitely didn't look like flashlights from someone walking around. These lights were floating and moving around like they were alive. Some were near the ground, but others were hovering 10 feet in the air at least, bouncing around like they were a swarm of bees. It freaked him out. He turned back uphill to say something to my grandpa, but before he could get a word out, my grandpa just told him to keep moving, so my dad did. But he kept looking back, watching the lights. He tried to get my grandpa to talk about it, asking him what he thought they were. They eventually got to the top of the first hill, and my grandpa finally told my dad to get down near this large patch of rabbit brush. They crawled partially under a big one, and my grandpa pulled out his binoculars. It turned out that he had noticed the lights too, but didn't want whatever it was to know they were there. He was worried whatever this was would see them and possibly follow them up the hill. He wanted to keep an eye on the whole situation from a distance in case it was something weird or possibly dangerous. They were lying there under this bush at 4-something in the morning, dead quiet, sharing binoculars and watching. My dad said the lights kept floating around their camp the entire time, moving in weird, erratic patterns like they were looking for something. He said they had a very unnatural red color, like the kind of red you see on an old alarm clock, but brighter. He said it looked like they were going through their tent and all of their things around camp. Then, right around dawn, things got really weird. As the sun started to peek over the hills, my dad and grandpa both heard an extremely loud, high-pitched sound echoing up from the valley. It was sharp and painful, like a loud ringing that just drilled you in the head. They both actually covered their ears because of how loud it was, and at the same time they noticed that the lights were rising up into the air. Slowly at first, and then a little faster until they were several hundred feet in the air, almost to the same elevation they were at on the hill. They also noticed that the higher the lights went into the air, the quieter the ringing sound got. They seemed to all reach a certain height, got a little brighter, and then within seconds they dispersed in several directions at once and were completely gone. They didn't move from that bush for 20 to 30 minutes. They just laid there in silence, kind of in shock and waiting for the sun to fully come up. When it got lighter, my grandpa finally said they should head back down to camp and check everything out. After hiking back down the hill, they reached their camp and it was a complete mess. All of their stuff was thrown around. Bags had been emptied out, gear and food were scattered all over the place, and the tent was even lying flat on the ground, but nothing was missing. It was like something had ransacked through everything, but didn't care enough to take anything. He said they talked about what to do, and my grandpa decided it was best to pack up and leave because he was worried about their safety out there. They packed everything up within a half hour and left. My dad said they both agreed to never go back to that area again. Even now, if someone brings up anything related to UFOs or paranormal, my dad will bring up that story, and every time he tells it, he looks like he's reliving and remembering it all over again. He always says, "We don't know what was out there, but something knew we were, and it didn't seem to want us there." My grandpa passed away when I was younger, and I remember him, but never got a chance to talk about this story with him. I would have loved to sit down and hear his version of it. I have been around my uncle, my dad's older brother, when my dad's told the story, and he says that grandpa had the exact same story. He also says that grandpa would never make up a story like that, and being a veteran, I guess he always wondered if it was military. Possibly government weapons testing or surveillance going on out there. Whatever they saw, I know it would have freaked me out just as much as it did my dad. I've never been into hunting like my dad and my uncles are, but the times I have gone out with them, that story is playing in the back of my mind the entire time.